Yeah.
All right, welcome everyone. First of all, thank you for taking your time attending our webinar. My name is Daniela, and I'm Marketing Manager at Xenit. And today we are talking about a really hot topic, GDPR. For someone, GDPR is a buzzword, but the reality is that GDPR is a fact, is a regulation, and all companies have to be compliant by May 25, 2018. Today we are so glad to host a so special guest. Going quickly through the agenda, we start with Bart van Bouwel from CDI Partners. Thanks, Bart, for being with us today. He's going to provide us with GDPR principles. What does it mean GDPR in practice? And then we go with our other special guest, George Parapadakis from Alfresco. Thanks, George, for your time. He's going to show us how Alfresco can help companies to comply with the regulation. And the second part of this webinar, our CEO and Director, Ronnie Timmermans, is going to share with us the Xenit approach for the GDPR and provide us with the top tips for preparing for the regulation. And finally, with our ECM software architect, Tess Lemons and Giovanni, we show you Xenit use case. I would recommend to collect all questions. You can write down through the chat if you want, and then at the end of the session we have a Q&A session. And I think now I can leave the word to Bart. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daniela. Okay.
Yeah, share just the screen. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Bart van Bouwel. I'm with CDI Partners, and CDI stands for Customer Driven IT. And we help companies with strategic IT-related projects such as GDPR, but also with business IT alignment, creating more value for digital investments. And we do this by improving the organizational model, the related processes, and the company's culture. And the same three levers, organization, culture, and processes, are important if you want to achieve a successful GDPR implementation. And together with Xenit, we have developed a solution based on Alfresco to help companies comply with this challenging legislation, with a major aspect of it, getting your documents under control. So, GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, is a European regulation. That means it's a European law, and but it's applicable worldwide to all companies that process personal data of European citizens. Now, GDPR ensures transparency about the use of data and requires organizations to adequately protect the data they collect. And as you probably know, GDPR is already in force, but with a 2-year transition period that ends less than 6 months from now, May 2015, 2018. Now, GDPR is all about personal data and giving individuals control over their own personal data. So I won't go into detail about GDPR, as this will lead us too far, but just for people who are not familiar with it, some important principles. So processing must be lawfully, fairly, and transparent. This means that companies should be very open about which data they collect and also what they plan to do with it. It has to be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes. And this means that for a lot of data, you will need consent if you want to process it. And then it has to be adequate, relevant, and limited. And here we will see an important shift in behavior, the cultural aspect, if you want, because in the past, a lot of companies would collect as many data as possible and keep it, well, forever. But GDPR promotes data minimization. So just keep the data you need for as long as you need it. Because the more data you keep, the more expensive it gets, because GDPR wants you to keep your data up to date, and also the associated risk of having this data increases, because the more data you have, the more you can lose, and the higher the impact after a data breach. GDPR enforces existing rights of data subjects and also adds new ones, for instance, the data portability. And then you also need to adapt internal processes. Privacy by design means that when you develop a new product or you introduce a new process, you have to think about data privacy and protection upfront and also document this. So you will need to adapt your product development process and your change processes. And of course, data breach protection, data breach notification is mandatory, so you will probably need extra processing and processes for this too. Probably everybody has heard about the high fines associated with GDPR. The good news is fines are a last measure. Now, the bad news is that although fines are proportional, they're proportional to the scale of the infringement. This not to the scale of the company. So this means that even a small company that persists on doing things horribly wrong with the data they collect can face fines up to 20 million euro. Also, a lot of other measures are possible. Authorities can take other measures. For instance, impose a definitive limitation or a ban on processing of certain personal data. Now, before we go into what to do, I want to just take a look at personal data. The definition is information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. And on this slide, you can see some types of some categories of personal data. And I want to go in how broad this concept really is. If I would collect the IMEI number, so the unique identifier of a portable device, to see how people navigate through the portable version of my website, this browsing history is considered to be personal data. For me, it's anonymous because I don't know who's holding the phone, but as it is a unique identifier, it is possible to make this link. So in the definition, it's seen as personal data, and the same goes for other technical identifiers like IP addresses. And this means personal data is not only to be found in your customer database or in your HR system in a structured form, but it's also everywhere in an unstructured form, in documents, in listings, in reports, in spreadsheets, and even in technical files like log files, you'll probably find personal data. Now, a lot of companies have already started with GDPR programs. A lot more even have to start. And the ones that have started are collecting and making an inventory of the personal data in their databases, marking it as, as personal data, looking at retention periods and see if they can properly delete it, something that's proving to be very difficult. But if you're struggling with the timing of your GDPR program, or if you have to start, where should you start? Would you start with structured data, the easy part, because it's stored in databases, access through applications, you have a lot of control? Or do you have to start with the unstructured data in the documents and the files? And this is everywhere. It's on your local drives, on network drives, on emails, in the cloud, USB keys. These files are easily copied and distributed, so you don't have a lot of control, and it's more difficult to protect this. But so if you're struggling, where do you have to start, the structured data or the unstructured data? Well, let's see in practice to some examples, and of course there are no GDPR examples available up till now. But we can look to the Data Protection Act in the UK. As other European privacy legislation, it's based upon the Directive of '95, but it was an important, it was used when writing the GDPR, and data breach notification in the UK is already a best practice, and they handle about 3,000 breaches every year. So everything is made public, the number of breaches, and also the fines they give. So it's a very good starting point. I took all the data breaches of the first quarter of 2017, and here are the different categories. And the number one type of data breach is in fact a combination of two. It's data sent to the wrong recipient by email, by post, or by fax. And so in the UK, one in 5 breaches has to do with personal data, so in an unstructured form. In the Netherlands, where data breach notification is already mandatory, this is 46% of all breaches reported has to do with documents sent to the wrong person. If you look at these two, unauthorized or unlawful processing or cyber incidents, they have to do with structured and unstructured data. And these categories, loss of theft of paperwork, data left in insecure location, and loss of theft of unencrypted device are related to documents. I don't have a DB2 database on my phone, but I have a lot of emails and access to all my documents in the cloud. So I put a little icon in front of every category that's linked to documents. And in fact, more than 50% of the breaches are related to documents, and less than 20% of the data breaches are related to structured data. Now, if you look at the fines that are given, and I collected all the fines from January till September, I will see that 42% of the fines are related to marketing. And although marketing is an important issue in GDPR, and you do need consent to send people mailings, most of these breaches that are fined are for companies making deliberate decisions not to comply. There's an example of a company getting a fine of £400,000, but they made over 100 million nuisance calls. So the cost of making the calls is a lot higher than the fine that can be given. Under GDPR, they face 20 million, so hopefully this percentage will go down. But in fact, the biggest risks are found in the other 58% of the cases. And here are some examples of fines that are given: sensitive data lost in the mail, employees accessing or stealing sensitive data, a lot of cases there, a cyber attack stealing 30,000 emails. Then my personal favorite, after buying new office furniture, they sold off the old ones and they left paper files in it with sensitive data. Laptops containing sensitive documents that were stolen, also some examples there. And then a lawyer backing up sensitive documents to a free cloud storage, which proved not to be too safe. So all these fines were given for breaches related to unstructured data. And secondly, most breaches and almost all cases that are fined are from undeliberate or deliberate acts from within the company. So the cyber incidents, the type of breach was about 14%. If you look at the fines, it's even lower. It's 9% of the fines are given for cyber incidents. In the Netherlands, it's only 6%. So although it is important, the biggest risk is not there. Authorities will not have the manpower to check GDPR compliance proactively. In practice, fines will be given after someone files a complaint, after data breach, or some right to access hasn't been honored. So if we focus on solutions that prevent data breaches, this will buy you time to get fully compliant. And this is also our conclusion. if you're struggling with the timing, or if you have to start with processes related to rights of individuals, because these are very visible, and then we think of privacy statements, proof of consent, the demands to access, correct, and erase data. And secondly, focus on the documents, focus on unstructured data. And to make this very tangible, what functionalities do you need for protecting these documents? I've made a list of challenges with regards to unstructured data. So first, how do you know what documents to protect? How do you know they contain personal data? So challenge one, identify documents containing personal data and label them appropriately. Secondly, you have to adequately protect these documents. So challenge two, state-of-the-art security of the documents and the metadata. Then there's the aspect of responsibility. Organizations must prove that they process personal data in a responsible way, and they need proof of having a legitimate purpose or consent to hold the document. So challenge three, monitor and control access to the documents and store the right metadata as to prove legitimate purpose. If data is on a portable device and it's important to work offline, how can this be protected? So challenge four, make documents available offline in a secure way. And if something has gone wrong, how to know what data has been lost or stolen. So challenge five, detect breaches. Now, personal data cannot be kept longer than necessary or must be removed after a legitimate demand to be forgotten. So challenge six, keep track of the right time to delete documents and permanently delete the documents so no backup copies exist. And finally, sometimes it's needed to share documents with another party. How will you know who you have shared the document with and for what legitimate reason? And how to inform the third party of a request to be forgotten. So challenge seven, control the usage of documents by external parties. So with Alfresco, with the Alfred GDPR suits up for these challenges, I hope to get a positive answer of Ronnie, but first I think it's George. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is George Paravadakis. I work for Alfresco, and thank you very much, Bert, for the summary. I think it's a great explanation of the background to GDPR, and particularly the summary of the 7 challenges. So what I'm hoping to do in the next 15 minutes or so is give you some idea of how the Alfresco digital business platform can be used to address some of these challenges that Bert talked about. Now, starting, I want to say that there's no way in 15 minutes we can cover all the possible functionality or all the possible capabilities that we can address. But the platform itself and the models, the frameworks we have designed around it can address over 24 different GDPR articles that cover quite a lot of the challenges that Bert described, and quite a few things extra to that. So I'm not going to go to any detail about GDPR specifically, but what I want to describe is the key areas that we focus on when we talk about GDPR. So as a basic introduction, let me just explain very briefly what we call the digital business platform. So you'll see here many different layers of functionality which form the platform. In the core, in the center of it, and the area where we will focus mostly today, is the specific engines that sit in the middle. So you'll see the Alfresco Process Services engine, which manages workflow processes, and you might see it abbreviated as APS. The Alfresco Content Services, which is the core repository that holds the unstructured information and the documents and all the metadata related to that, and that's called Alfresco Content Services, or ACS. And going across both of these is a set of capabilities called Alfresco Governance Services, which have to do with the records management and the protection and the disposition of the life cycle of each content inside the repository. So these are the 3 key areas I will focus as I go through the platform. There's obviously a lot of other capabilities which I'm not going to go to. Now, the other thing I want to mention is what I will explain today is the capability of the core platform. partners like Xenit provide additional capabilities, and you'll see later in the presentation how that core platform can be extended to address very specific needs beyond what the core platform can do. So let me just start with the first component of the framework. The first one, and the most obvious one, is managing policies. Every organization that has to address GDPR, like any other compliance requirement, has to redesign, review, and adjust their policies internally and their procedures to be compliant. So most of internal policies that have to deal with how you manage data have to be revised to support GDPR. And not only you have to revise your policies, but you have to very explicitly certify your users in understanding and having agreed that they have understood and approve of the policies. So the first element that we can provide is a collaborative authoring environment where you can either write policies or amend your policies by collaborative working on things like Google Docs or Office environment to revise and create new policies. Now, once they've been created, you can run a workflow that will drive them through a review and approval process, and then distribute them within the different departments that need to be able to have their users certified that they read and understood the policy. And of course, that cycle repeats through a revision at the end of it because policies are continuously monitored. Now, the key element here is not so much the process, is the fact that you have an audit trail, and you'll see that coming up again and again on some of these slides, which is the idea is that everything you do is captured by the system and can be reported to the regulators. So you can prove to the regulators that you've gone through the right process and you've taken the right actions to be able to comply with the regulation. Now, the second one, and probably the most important element, addresses some of the key issues that Bert was talking about. How do you identify, how do you protect, and how do you manage information that is GDPR sensitive? So how do you how can you isolate the content inside your repository that is GDPR sensitive, that contains personal data, from all the other content that you're holding that may not? And to do that, we've designed a framework and a model that extends the standard document definition and metadata definitions in Alfresco to specifically cater for GDPR needs. So GDPR has this concept of an asset register. So in effect, we're turning the repository into an asset register, not only of content that lives inside the repository, but also content that might live outside, but you're referencing it in your asset catalog. So the first section just extends the metadata to be able to describe the relevant fields around the asset of how it's being managed. So it not only marks that piece of content as GDPR sensitive, but contains all the relevant information about the asset that says what's the asset ID, which department owns it, which geography is it in, who is the subject that is being referenced in that asset, etc. Now, Bert mentioned that in order to lawfully process personal data, you have to have a justification. And the justification comes in two forms. Either there is a legal processing basis, which means you have the right because there is a contractual requirement, for example, or is part of your offering that you need to have that information about individuals. So for example, if you've got employees, you need to be able to have the personal data in your employee database. And that doesn't require an explicit consent. So we can capture the information around what is the legal processes, the legal base on which you're processing data, or you can attach information about the explicit consent you have received from users to be able to process that data. Now, both of these can be added and can be removed and can and have deadlines for which expire to satisfy the requirement for deleting them where you no longer need to keep that information. But also based on the reasoning of why are you holding that information, what gives you the entitlement to hold it, we also attach security capabilities around the security marks that define which users from which department with which roles have got the right to process that information. So that way we're protecting the information inside the repository by only giving access to the relevant people that are allowed to see it. Of course, since it's a content management repository, you can keep renditions of the document, you can keep different versions that are anonymized or redacted to deal with pseudonymization. That's another requirement in GDPR. And behind all of this, we are capturing the audit trail of all access to that information. So the fact that it is a sensitive data asset means we can track and monitor and capture and report on every single activity around that, whether people have changed the metadata behind it, whether people have downloaded it or accessed it, etc. So you can get all the information you need to be able to respond to the regulators. So that's the model, and it's quite extensive around how do you protect the information inside the content repository. Now, the opposite side of that, and again, this might be relevant to some organizations that are larger and need to start automating some of the capabilities, have to do with the way processes are managed. So GDPR in itself describes quite a few operational processes that you need to manage. Things like being able to respond to subject access requests. So people who want access to their data, they need to be able to port their data to move them from one supplier to another supplier. They need to be able to remove the data, so the right to be forgotten. You need to be able to change your data and update your data. So what we have done is design a model process that allows you to control and automate parts of that exercise. Now, the difference around that process is not only that it follows through and makes sure that the right things happen at the right time by the right people in responding to a user request. We can have a common process that works across any different access, because a request will come from different ways. It will come through email, it will come as a letter, it will come through a telephone conversation, or if you're a bank and you walk into a bank branch, you can do the request in person in a bank. So we can have a consistent way of responding to these processes. What we also can do is define what type of process it is. What is the person asking for? Are they asking to just change the details, in which case we will direct the process to the relevant database to be able to amend it? Are they asking to withdraw their consent because they previously said, yes, you can market information to me. Now they no longer want to do that, in which case we remove the consent, withdraw the consent. Are they asking for the data to be collected and exported across multiple systems? And I'll come back to that in a second. Or are they asking for the data to be removed? So the idea is that depending on what type of request it is, and sometimes they'll come in multiples, you're able to decide which way you're going to handle it. And I mentioned very briefly the collection of data. Collection of data for data portability is going to be one of the biggest challenges around GDPR. Because if you think an organization, especially larger organizations, have data across multiple hundreds or even thousands of systems, how do you control the process of collecting all that data and assembling it in a way that you can provide it to an individual or send it to a third party that needs to manage it? So we can manage that process. We can prepare the response back to the individual, and we can notify the third parties when necessary to be able to do exactly the same with the data. And behind that, again, we're capturing the complete audit trail so we can show the regulators that we've done the right things. The final part is to do with reporting. So one of the key elements and differences of GDPR with other compliance regulations, it's not sufficient to just have the policies. You have to proactively monitor and report back to the regulators that you're doing the right things at the right time. And for that, whether it's reporting on your asset register, being able to define what things have expired and things have to be deleted, being able to measure your key performance indicators and service access levels around your response to customers, being able to prove that all your employees have been certified on following the policies. All of these things need reporting capabilities that can come out of capturing the information in the system in the first place. So just to quickly summarize, the purpose of the digital business platform in the context of GDPR is to do data privacy by design. If you design the model that protects the data from the moment it comes into your organization, the data is identified, is kept secure, and is shared in the right way with the right people, you can secure and protect that data around the inside the GDPR principles. What you can also do is use the process capabilities to automate some of the requirements around how that's being processed, whether it's subject access requests, or whether it's breach notifications that need to happen in 72 hours, or whether it's risk impact assessments for data privacy, or whether it's contract management to try and renegotiate your contracts with your suppliers and third-party providers. And finally, behind all of this, we are consistently and constantly collecting information about what happens to that data. So when you get a request from a regulator, or get a request from audit, or get a request from an individual whose data you're holding, you can respond and you can provide reports to say exactly what has happened to that data. So with that, I will leave you and hand it over to Xenit to continue. Thanks very much.
Thank you, George. And now is the moment for Ronnie.
Thank you, Daniela. So, first of all, Bart laid out the challenges I think we have for GDPR. George showed us the tremendous capabilities that Alfresco has as a base platform. Now, I would like to explain how with Alfred and our products, we actually add a layer of security and how we implement this as a solution to the customers. So it all starts with the data, of course. You have to analyze. You have three big categories of data. The first category is personal data. The second one is sensitive information. And I would say the third one is highly sensitive information. The difference between number 2 and number 3 is number 3 is about criminal convictions and offenses, which is definitely a specific and a very special category of personal information. Now, these three categories actually drive also how you can process those data and whose consent you need. You need the consent of the user, but then you can use those data. If you want to process sensitive data of the third category, you need actually the consent of government to process those. So we want to help you having a system that implements those measures. We have also put forward at least 2 protection principles with Alfred. What do we want to implement in your environments on top of Alfresco? First protection principle is, unless you know a key, you should not be able to access personal information. The key can be a ID card number, it can be a bank account number, it can be any personally identifiable information to retrieve personal information, depending, of course, on the category of information. Secondly, protection principle is do not show information to people that is GDPR sensitive unless they need to have access to it according to the role they play in your organization from a GDPR point of view. So we put together the Alfred GDPR package, which builds upon the fantastic Alfresco content services that George has demonstrated. George also demonstrated that you can use Alfresco process services and Alfresco governance services to enrich that functionality with processes and with governance capabilities. We, as Xenit, with our Alfred product line, have a GDPR edition of Alfred Desktop and Alfred Finder to be released, of course, first quarter of next year, which allows you from a user point of view to control who can see what and who can do what on data. That's the user-facing layer. Secondly, we have an API gateway layer that is called Alfred Edge that actually can filter requests, that can audit requests, even before requests for information reach Alfresco. So you can protect Alfresco at that layer and level. Thirdly, what we do inside Alfresco are 3 things. We try to identify personally identifiable information. We try to control it then, who can access, who can modify, who can share that information. And of course, the third part is to manage the process of consent, getting consent from your user, but also maybe to implement the right to be forgotten. So those basic operations that are linked to GDPR protection of data, those things we provide them out of the box in the GDPR package, Alfred GDPR. It builds up on top of Alfresco audit, the document model, behaviors, metadata, all the things you know. So the first layer, as explained, is the user access layer with our desktop solution, previously called Fred, today Alfred Desktop. Alfred Finder is the web complement. Both work together, give access to different profiles of users. What we can do is to modify who can search on things, who can see data. Give you an example. We can protect whether certain metadata are visible or not. Of course, GDPR sensitive metadata to any role that you define in your organization. And we have extended controls to search, to edit metadata, to see the results. Do you want to have the capability in your system that somebody queries on a wildcard and sees like all the columns with personally sensitive information? You want at least to control who can do what on those data. If you then look at the server, well, we do two basic things. Is we extend the document model with a number of aspects. George has shown those as well in his presentation. That is how to record information about consent, how to classify your information in terms of the categories of GDPR. So there's data to be captured, that's document model extension. There are also operations to be provided. And the two classical advantage or examples there are to record your consent to use and also to implement the request to forget, because that's not so simple. You have to know where you can get those data in order to delete them in the end. Okay, this is the first step there. Whenever we enter information into the system, and it's something that we're going to extend in the future, but today we already have detection capabilities for personally identifiable information. It works on the basis of regular expressions. So we can detect whether you have, like, for instance, ID numbers. There is a certain consistency to those numbers in the state of Belgium, where you have checksums. So we can, with a very high probability, detect that kind of personal information. There are also conventions, so bank account numbers, credit card numbers, those things. All that kind of information for which you want to detect that it is there and label it and put it in the right category of your GDPR data. We can today handle documents and emails. Emails is one of those important channels of breaches. You send out things, so you want to make sure that whatever is being shared via email is verified by your organization. And if you want to search for people, we can use master data of your environment, names, and use the nice capabilities of Solar to retrieve that information. Of course, any capability is also a risk. You have to protect those capabilities because it could be easy to retrieve lots of personal information from your system. So it's important to protect, but it's a good leverage to be able to classify and to govern your information. Well, that's the overview then of the architecture. It's not specifically for GDPR. The architecture is because we think it's a good blueprint architecture with different layers, but we inject GDPR capabilities and protection at every layer. Of course, end user facing at the level of the desktop and the Finder, and then at the level of the API, because there are lots of third-party systems accessing your Alfresco. So it's no good to only protect end user access. You also have to protect third-party access. We work in the steps identify, control, and consent, and we build upon the capabilities of Alfresco. Good. That brings us to the challenges that Bart put forward in his presentation. How are we going to respond to those? So quickly, an overview. You want to identify documents containing personal data and label them. You want to have state-of-the-art security for documents and metadata. You want to monitor and control access to documents and store metadata to prove legitimate purpose of usage. You want to make documents available offline, yes, but in a secure way, because you're creating copies, and that's the risk of data leaks. You want to detect breaches. Well, ideally, you would like to prevent breaches, but first of all, you have to log, and then you want to detect them, because you need to detect them as you have to report them to the government whenever that has happened. So that is also a way to secure your compliance with GDPR. Then the document deletion, that is, keep documents for the right time, delete them and permanently delete them, make sure that there are no copies dangling around, no backups, etc. And that is actually a matter of good records management. I think that's also an illustration of how GDPR compliance is kind of a form of having good governance on your data, not just for privacy, but governance on information in general. Last point is control the documents, the usage of documents by external parties. So we'll go through each of those very briefly, because there's a lot. Just highlight the most important points. So if we identify documents containing personal data and label them, we do that with our detection module. So you find documents that actually you have to classify. Then we could give you user interface as well to do the classification, or try to do it as automatic as possible. That depends a little bit on the circumstances of your data, actually, when you treat them. Okay? State-of-the-art security. There are a few best practices from the Alfresco box, like encryption of database, encryption of GDPR information, protection of your indexes, that you can do with Alfresco. So it's just a matter of using it, of course, to activate the audit. And then from a product Alfred GDPR point of view, we have implemented a special way to impose access control on documents via roles and metadata. So that deviates a bit from the standard ACL process that Alfresco has. ACL stands for access control lists, and it makes it just easier to add that kind of protection and not make your ACL structures very complex. Okay? Monitor and control access to documents. Well, that's by, we try to promote a lot sending out information by reference and not by copy. So we think it's a good idea to send out links, so people who get those links for a certain period of time and that they have to authenticate can actually access the information. If you want to download that information, that should be an explicit action that we can record. Who is downloading this? You could even watermark your information. But the first thing is try to share by reference and not by copy. So we're supporting this, and we're also auditing any kind of operations on top of that. So this is where I think Alfred Desktop shines. We have local copies, and it's by a Alfred Desktop solution that you have a lot of control on local copies. Things you are editing offline, things you downloaded, thanks to the fact that you have an Alfred Desktop at your disposal, we can control what kind of information, what kind of copies are kept, not just in the download directory, but under control of your tool. Okay, brings us to detect breaches. Yes, well, that's where the API gateway comes in. We log a lot of information, we audit that information. You can set alarms because some of the operations you are performing are not normal. If anybody tries to download a list with all available personal or sensitive information, that should trigger a small alarm, we think. And you can check all those things via the API gateway. Of course, that is not completely out of the box because you have to configure your alarms and your policies to do that properly. Okay? Delete or shield privacy-related documents as soon as appropriate. That talks about if you don't need to expose this document, if people should not see these documents, make sure they have very close and stringent access control requirements as soon as possible put them under records. Do not expose that via access to the larger audience. The best way to handle data breaches are just to prevent them, of course, and there Alfresco helps you to do that. I think that's almost the last point. Use document, sorry, well, yeah. Let me tell you something about this here. Share by link, we explained. If you share content, it should be an explicit action. It should be, you are sure who does it. We are including all that in audit, to whom you are sharing, all that needs to be audited and controlled. Okay, that brings me to the last slide, I think. Yeah, before we pass on to the demo by Thijs and Giovanni, or let's say an illustration of a use case, better said. Wrapping it up in best practices, share a controlled copy. Don't send information out in the wild, certainly not category 1, 2, or 3 GDPR information. Encrypt information as much as possible, so criminal entry into your system cannot lead to leaks. Show information on a need-to-know basis as much as possible. In our systems, try to support that. Audit and report what happens, and dispose of information for which you don't want to risk the fact that they lead to data breaches. So I think that concludes my part, and I'm happy to hand over to Thijs and Giovanni to describe a use case.
Thank you, Ronnie. I will present to you a use case that we recently implemented for a client. The client came to us with a problem. They needed to scan all their information for some type of sensitive information and remove that information from their databases and unstructured documents. This information was in 2 forms. They, like many companies, they use the shared drive. A shared drive with about 3 million documents, and they had their emails in Office 365, and that were about 8 million emails. All of those, in total 11 million documents and emails together, had to be scanned and removed when containing sensitive information. This use case has been realized within 3.5 months. And we did it with this approach. We moved every document from the shared drive to Alfresco, and also every email from Office 365 to Alfresco. In Alfresco, we had a scanning procedure that scanned all the documents for this sensitive information and recorded all this information within the metadata of the document. This allows us to use the search engine of Alfresco to find the documents that are marked as containing sensitive information. And we had a workflow that allowed the user to decide what to do with the documents, either to clean the document, so maybe to open it and remove the sensitive information and save it again, or just to delete it, or to decide that this document needs to be kept for some good reason. In this use case, it was a one-off scan because of the time limit we had, but we are looking now into the future to have some constant governance on their documents and emails. Giovanni will now continue with a tour of the application.
Yeah, so we built a tool which is based on Alfred Desktop, which is a tool, a UI tool that is Microsoft Explorer layout-like. So at the left, you see the list of folders on the Alfresco repository. On the middle panel, you see the list of documents that are visible in the selected folder. At the right, you see the panel with all the metadata linked to this document, the selected document. And at the right, you see also the preview of this document. So here, we uploaded 3 documents with or not sensitive data. So we have selected it here one document, and which is shown as a clean document because in the content there is no data in there. So we see it to the right. If we now upload content with sensitive data, here we have a document with credit card numbers. So by uploading this document, there is a process in Alfresco that is triggered and which parses the content of the document and looks for patterns of data, credit card numbers or VAT numbers. And when there is such data, there are some properties in Alfresco that are populated. Here we have the status that is populated as to review, not clean anymore. So we have to have a look to this document, and you can see also that the data are shown here at the bottom, and you see the number of sensitive data. So here it's credit card numbers. You can search for VAT numbers and other type of data. We search for all types of documents. We search for inside Word document, Excel document, text document, PDF document, but also emails, and also in emails attachments. And we search also not only in the content, but also in the name of the document, because the name can also contain sensitive data. So when the name contains data, we see them also in the properties.
Okay, we can start the Q&A session now. If
well, maybe if you go again to the previous slide.
Yeah.
Giovanni, you had there a number of queries that you wanted to mention. So once the data was screened and tagged for being processed, then obviously there was a specific workflow that needs to be run through. So the information that was tagged as being in review or needed to be reviewed was appointed to specific persons, and then based upon a number of processes, queries were defined, like initial not scanned, initial to review, not scannable to keep, but, and so on, so that people could review the content and take action. Action might have been remove, because if you want to clean up an email, the only option is to delete it. You cannot change the content of the email. But on a document, you have the options to retain it, clean it up, or delete the whole document. And so if you would have done edit offline of the content and you updated the content again to the server, then the same screening process would kick off, and automatically the server would detect that the sensitive information is not available anymore. It would clean up the metadata field, and it would tag it as being a document that is cleaned. So as such, it is a continuous process, but for this first step, due to certain timeframes, we have to clean up the whole 11 million documents. And as from now, they are in sync with those rules, and we will continue to extend into the future the GDPR model, as it is a living model which is built upon the practical experience which is built on in the field, and we will be able to keep these people GDPR compliant. So I guess this finishes up the slide demonstration, and we are open for any kind of questions. Please feel free to put questions in the chat box, or to unmute your microphone and to pose a question. Okay, I guess at this moment nobody is really stepping forward. George, from your side, do you have some more comments to add, specific questions?
Just one thing, I would say GDPR is not going anywhere. It's here now, so start as soon as possible to look at how you can address your issues.
Okay, so in general, GDPR, it poses a lot of questions. There's no defined and strict answer to GDPR, but we are building a model and a process which is capable of evolving over time and which is adaptable to your specific situation. So the process is well defined, but the parameters which are specific for your specific case can be modeled within it. And so where GDPR is covering everything, you cannot cover everything from the start, but you have to have a very good starting point and show that your effort is continuously enhancing. And as such, that is the kind of approach that we take to make it a configurable model that can be extended to be more and more fine-tuned and make sure that you can at each time say, yes, I am compliant with GDPR and I have a continuous process to enhance whatever is going wrong in my process. Okay, any more questions at this moment?
Okay, so we can basically conclude here this webinar. Here our social account, and then you can always go into the landing page. On the left side, you can find the QR code where you can find the same information into the GDPR page. Ask more questions if you want, just simply by filling the form that you can find there. And again, we thank you for taking your time and attending our webinar.